Master Sergeant Elias Thorne, U.S. Army, retired, had run out of road. Disinherited from a family fortune he never wanted, he was given the one thing his cruel uncle deemed worthless: a derelict hunting lodge on a forgotten mountain in Montana. He arrived with a rusted Ford truck, his last $300, and Ghost, the Belgian Malinois, who had dragged him from a burning Humvee in Kandahar. He expected only a quiet place to disappear. But on the second day, Ghost, his scarred and silent partner, froze. The dog stared at the stone wall of the library fireplace, a low growl rumbling in his chest, and behind that wall waited a secret sealed for 40 years, a secret that would drag Elias back into a war he thought he'd left behind, and give him a reason to live again. The road to the lodge was more of a memory than a path, a pair of ruts clawing up the side of the mountain through dense, silent stands of pine and fir. Elias kept the truck in low gear, the engine complaining as it climbed, the chassis groaning over rocks and fallen branches. Each jolt was a dull ache in his hip, a permanent souvenir from the IED that had ended his career and taken his friend, Sergeant Miller. He didn't need the pain to remember. The memory lived behind his eyes, a flicker of searing white light and the smell of superheated metal and burning diesel. It came for him in his sleep, and sometimes, when the world was too quiet, it came for him in the daylight. That's when Ghost would press his heavy body against Elias's leg, a solid, living anchor in the swirling chaos of the past. The dog was 13 now, his muzzle gone gray and his own gait stiff from shrapnel that was still working its way out of his hide. But his eyes were as sharp as ever. He watched the forest pass with a calm, professional stillness that Elias understood completely. They were two old soldiers at the end of a long, hard war, looking for a place to stand down. His daughter Sarah hadn't returned his calls in over a year. He couldn't blame her. The man who came home from that last deployment wasn't the father she remembered. He was a ghost in his own house, haunted by things he couldn't explain, and the distance between them grew until it was a chasm he no longer knew how to cross. He carried a worn photograph of her in his wallet, a smiling 16-year-old with his eyes and her mother's fire. She would be 24 now. The lodge appeared through the trees suddenly, a hulking shape of dark timber and river stone, bigger than he'd expected. It had a wide, sagging porch and windows like vacant eyes. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress that had lost its purpose. His uncle, Marcus Thorne, a man who built a corporate empire on foundations of pure ruthlessness, had left his multi-million-dollar estate to Elias's cousins. To Elias, he left this: the one property Marcus called the mistake. The lawyer's letter had been clear. The property came with a lien for 5 years of unpaid taxes. It cost Elias the last of his disability check to clear it, a final act of spite from the grave. He had bought his own exile for $287. He parked the truck, the engine ticking in the sudden silence of the high country. Ghost leapt from the passenger seat, his paws sinking into a carpet of pine needles. The air was thin and cold, clean. Elias leaned against the fender, the ache in his hip sharp and grounding. This was it, the end of the line. He'd stopped in the only town for 50 miles, Garnet Creek, a place clinging to the side of a valley with a general store, a diner, and a sheriff's office. The keys were with the estate's caretaker, an old man named Henderson, who ran the hardware supply. Henderson was a piece of tanned leather with shrewd, pale eyes. He'd taken one look at Elias's military-style haircut, the way he stood, the faded 10th Mountain Division patch on his old jacket, and nodded slowly. "You're Thorne's nephew, then," he said. It wasn't a question. He unlocked a drawer behind the counter and pulled out a single, heavy iron key on a loop of frayed cord. "Marcus never came up here," Henderson said, wiping the key on his canvas apron. "Not once in 40 years. Sent a check for my services once a year and that was it. But people used to ask about the place. Long time ago." He paused, his gaze drifting to the mountains visible through his dusty shop window. They weren't asking about Marcus. They were asking about the man who built it. A fella named Alistair Finch. Folks around here said he wasn't what he seemed. He handed the key to Elias, his grip surprisingly firm. "Place has a history. Just be aware, some history doesn't like to stay buried." The warning hung in the air, smelling of sawdust and rust. Elias had thanked him, bought a few supplies, canned stew, coffee, a box of shotgun shells for an old pump action he kept behind the truck seat, and driven on. Now, standing before the lodge, Henderson's words felt less like local gossip and more like a statement of fact. The place was built to last, and to hide. The stone foundation was massive. The log walls were thick enough to stop a bullet. He turned the heavy key in the lock. The door swung inward on groaning hinges, opening into a great room dominated by a cavernous fireplace. A fine layer of dust covered everything. The air was stale, cold, and smelled of pine rot and old smoke. Marcus had stripped the place bare. The walls showed pale rectangles where paintings once hung, and the vast library off the main room was a skeleton of empty shelves. Elias found a stack of dry firewood on the porch and set about building a fire. He needed the warmth, but more than that, he needed to push back the oppressive silence. As flames finally caught and began to lick up the soot-blackened stones of the chimney, he felt a sliver of the tension in his shoulders ease. He dropped his pack and bedroll onto the floor. Home, for now. He was turning to heat a can of stew on the hearth when he noticed Ghost. The dog wasn't exploring, wasn't sniffing the corners for mice. He was standing perfectly still, rigid as a statue, his gaze locked on the stone wall to the right of the fireplace. For the first hour, Elias tried to ignore it. He told himself it was rats in the walls, a draft, the unfamiliar sounds of an old house settling. He ate his stew, the metal spoon scraping against the can. He called the dog. "Ghost, come on, boy, settle." The dog didn't move. His ears were pinned forward, his tail low and straight. A low, guttural growl started deep in his chest, a sound Elias hadn't heard since their last patrol outside the wire. It was a warning sound, a threat-imminent sound. Ghost took a step closer to the wall, then another, until his nose was nearly touching the mortar between two large, flat stones. He whined, a high, anxious noise, and then began to paw at the wall, his claws making a dry, scratching sound against the rock. Elias put down his can. He knew this dog better than he knew himself. He'd seen this exact behavior before, this unwavering, obsessive focus. It was the same way Ghost had alerted to a deeply buried weapons cache, the same way he'd signaled a pressure plate IED hidden under a pile of rubble. His doubt evaporated, replaced by a cold knot of certainty in his gut. The dog knew something. He walked over and knelt beside Ghost, running his hand over the stones. They were cold and solid. He pushed, testing for looseness. Nothing. He knocked his knuckles against the surface. Thud, thud, thud. Then, on the large, flat stone Ghost was fixated on, the sound changed. It wasn't a thud. It was a hollow thump, a resonance. He looked closer, running his fingers along the mortar line. It was a slightly different color, a grayer shade than the crumbling, century-old mortar surrounding it. It was newer. Someone had sealed this stone in place long after the rest of the fireplace was built. Ghost looked up at him, his dark eyes intense, and nudged Elias's hand with his nose, as if to say, "Right here. Get it open." Elias found a woodshed out back, its door hanging from a single rusted hinge. Inside, among piles of rotting firewood and forgotten tools, he found a heavy-duty crowbar and a 3-pound sledgehammer. The steel was cold in his hands, solid and real. Back in the library, Ghost watched his every move, panting with a tense excitement that mirrored Elias's own. He started with the hammer, tapping gently at first, then with more force, chipping away the newer mortar. It crumbled into gray dust, falling onto the hearthstones. It was slow, painstaking work. He was a soldier, trained in demolition, but this required a surgeon's care. He didn't want to damage whatever was behind the stone. He worked for nearly an hour, the rhythmic clink of the hammer the only sound besides the crackling fire and the dog's expectant breathing. Finally, he had cleared enough of the mortar to wedge the tip of the crowbar into the seam. He put his weight into it, leveraging the bar against the adjacent stone. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low groan of scraping rock, the stone shifted. He worked the crowbar deeper, and with one final grunting heave, the heavy slab of granite pivoted outward and fell to the hearth with a deafening crash that echoed through the empty house. Behind it was a dark, square hole, and set deep within the cavity was a black steel door. It was a safe, old, but clearly military grade. There was no combination dial, only a single heavy-duty keyhole. Resting on top of the safe, attached to a leather thong, was a key. It wasn't a puzzle. It was an invitation, a test of nerve. His heart hammered against his ribs as he took the key, the metal cold and smooth. It slid into the lock with a well-oiled click. He turned it, felt the tumblers engage, and pulled the heavy steel door open. The air that wafted out smelled of old paper and dust-free stillness. Inside, neatly stacked, were 3 distinct items. The first was a series of canvas-wrapped bundles. He lifted one out. It was heavy. He untied the cord and unfolded the canvas. His breath caught in his throat. Bearer bonds, dozens of them, issued in the 1970s from corporations like IBM, Exxon, and AT&T, and from the governments of Switzerland and West Germany. He opened another bundle, more of the same. The face value alone was in the millions, but beneath the bonds was something more potent, a set of hardbound ledgers. He opened the first one. The pages were filled with neat, precise columns of numbers, dates, and codes. They detailed a global network of offshore holdings, numbered Swiss bank accounts, and routing information. A quick, conservative tally in his head put the total somewhere north of $180 million. This wasn't just a nest egg. It was a shadow treasury. The second item was a thick, leather-bound journal. He opened it to the first page, the same precise, methodical handwriting as the ledgers. "My name is Alistair Finch," the first entry began, dated October 12, 1978. "If you are reading this, I am likely dead, and the world I knew is dead with me." Elias sat back on his heels, the firelight flickering on the page. Alistair Finch wrote that he had been a CIA case officer for 22 years, running off-the-books operations from the jungles of Laos to the streets of Santiago. This money, he explained, was not stolen for greed. It was a contingency fund, siphoned from black budgets over decades. It was severance and survival for his team of ghosts, assets and operatives who were deniable, men who could never go home, men whose governments would disavow them if they were ever caught. He wrote of his growing paranoia, of being followed, of his belief that a faction within the agency wanted the fund for themselves. He had built this lodge as a final sanctuary, a place to disappear. The third and final item was a single sealed envelope with the words, "For the next man," written on the front. He broke the wax seal. The note inside was short, the handwriting more hurried, more desperate. The last entry. They found me. My old partner, Marcus Thorne, sold me out. He was always greedy, always rotten. He wants the accounts, but he doesn't have all the keys. The real keys are not in the numbers, but in the names of the men we lost. If you're reading this, you're probably a soldier too. You'll understand. This money was meant to care for the families of ghosts. Don't let the jackals have it. They will kill you for it, just as they will kill me. Watch the man who smiles too much. Elias stared at the name. Marcus Thorne, his uncle, the man who had given him this place. It wasn't a worthless property. It was an unsolved crime scene. And the inheritance wasn't the lodge. It was the war that came with it. The silence of the lodge was no longer peaceful. It was watchful. Elias carefully packed the bonds, the ledgers, and the journal back into the safe and heaved the heavy stone back into place, jamming it tight with wood shims. It wouldn't fool a determined search, but it would pass a casual glance. He knew he couldn't stay here. Not now. But running felt wrong. Alistair's words resonated with the soldier's clarity. This money was meant to care for the families of ghosts. He felt a duty to the dead man, a stranger who spoke his language. The next morning, he was outside at dawn, walking the property line with Ghost at his heel. He wasn't admiring the view. He was scouting terrain, mapping fields of fire, identifying avenues of approach and retreat. It was automatic, a drill etched into his bones. As he scanned the dense tree line about 400 yards from the lodge, Ghost suddenly went rigid, a low growl starting in his chest. Elias followed the dog's gaze, and then he saw it. A tiny, brilliant flash of light, sunlight glinting off glass, binoculars, or a rifle scope. They were being watched. He dropped into a crouch, pulling Ghost down with him. He stayed there for a full minute, his heart a slow, steady drum. The glint was gone. He was no longer a retiree. He was a target on a contested perimeter. He backed away slowly, using the cover of a rocky outcrop to retreat to the lodge. The hunt his uncle had started 40 years ago was on again. 2 hours later, the sound of a powerful engine broke the silence. A polished black SUV, the kind favored by federal agents and corporate executives, navigated the rough track to the lodge with surprising ease. It parked 50 feet away, and a man in a tailored suit and gleaming shoes got out. He was in his late 40s, with a handsome, reassuring face and a smile that seemed permanently affixed. "Mr. Thorne," he called out, his voice smooth and friendly. "My name is Sterling. I'm with the Northern Rockies Conservancy Group." Elias stepped onto the porch, his old pump-action shotgun held loosely in his hand, muzzle down. Ghost stood beside him, hackles raised, a silent, menacing statue. The dog's distrust was a physical presence. Sterling's smile didn't falter, but his eyes flickered to the dog, then the shotgun. "We've been trying to acquire this parcel for years to create a wildlife preserve," he said, his tone reasonable, persuasive. "Your uncle was resistant. We're prepared to offer you $500,000 cash for the property. A quick, clean sale. You can be on your way by this afternoon." The offer was too good, too fast. It was a test. They wanted to see if he knew. Alistair's warning echoed in his mind. Watch the man who smiles too much. Elias kept his face neutral. I'm not interested in selling, he said, his voice flat. Sterling's smile tightened at the edges, a barely perceptible shift. Think about it, Mr. Thorne. Some places have a complicated history. It can be a burden for one man to carry alone. The implied threat was unmistakable. The offer stands, Sterling said, turning back to his vehicle. For now. As the SUV drove away, Elias memorized the license plate. He knew with absolute certainty that this was not over. It was just beginning. Elias knew he couldn't fight a war without intelligence. He locked the lodge, left Ghost on watch. The dog seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, taking up a position by the window with grim determination, and drove the truck back down the mountain to Garnet Creek. The town's small, quiet library was housed in the old courthouse, a stone building that smelled of old books and floor wax. The librarian was a woman in her late 50s named Eleanor Vance. She had sharp, intelligent eyes behind her reading glasses. Elias asked her if she had any information on a man named Alistair Finch. Her posture stiffened. He built the old Thorne Lodge, she said, her voice dropping. He vanished back in 1980. The official report said it was a hunting accident, that he was probably taken by a bear. They never found a body. She leaned forward, lowering her voice further. My father was the sheriff then. He never bought it for a second. He thought Finch was murdered. She explained that her father had been forced into an early retirement after he started asking pointed questions about how Marcus Thorne, a man with no local ties, had managed to acquire Finch's extensive property so quickly and quietly after his disappearance. She also told him that a massive faceless corporation called Global Strategic Solutions had spent the last 2 decades buying up all the land surrounding the Thorne property, effectively boxing it in. Seeing the look in Elias's eyes, a look she recognized from her father's own frustrated gaze, Eleanor made a decision. She led him to a back room, a dusty archive filled with cardboard boxes. From a locked file cabinet, she pulled a thin, worn folder. My father's private files on the Finch case, she said. He told me to keep them safe. Maybe you can find something he couldn't. The folder was filled with her father's meticulous notes, copies of witness statements that were officially dismissed, and a list of names, men who had worked for Finch on the lodge's construction, all of whom had left town abruptly after he disappeared. The drive back up the mountain felt different. The isolation was no longer a comfort. It was a vulnerability. As he rounded the final bend, his gut tightened. The heavy chain he'd strung across the access road was on the ground. The links had been severed by a pair of bolt cutters. The cut was fresh, the metal shining. Someone had been here. He approached the lodge cautiously, shotgun in hand. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the cold was deeper. Things had been moved. Books pulled from the empty shelves and tossed aside. The cold ashes in the fireplace sifted through. The mattress on his cot slashed open. It wasn't vandalism. It was a professional search, methodical and efficient. They hadn't found what they were looking for. The safe was still sealed, and he'd taken the journal with him. On the rough-hewn library table, they had left a message. A single black raven, its neck broken. That night, unable to sleep, Elias opened Alistair's journal again, searching for something, anything he might have missed. His eyes fell on the final cryptic line from the note. The real keys are not in the numbers, but in the names of the men we lost. He pulled out the list of names from Sheriff Vance's file. He began cross-referencing them with the account numbers in the ledger. It was a long shot, but he had nothing else. Then he saw it. An account designated for a trust, with the beneficiary listed only as Miller family. And the activation phrase wasn't a number, but a name. Sergeant David Miller. The same name as the man who had died beside him in the burning Humvee in Kandahar. A cold wave washed over him. This wasn't just about Cold War ghosts. Alistair's network had continued, evolving, a silent fund to care for the families of fallen soldiers from a new generation of wars. Sterling and his employers didn't just want to steal old money. They wanted to sever a lifeline that had been operating in the shadows for 40 years. The first flakes of snow began to fall just after midnight, thick and wet. By morning, the world was a sea of white, and the snow was still coming down, driven by a wind that howled through the pines. The weather report on his small hand-crank radio predicted a blizzard, 3 feet or more. The roads would be impassable. He was cut off, isolated, just as they wanted him. He spent the day preparing. He boarded up the lower windows, leaving only small slits to see through. He checked the action on his shotgun and the old .30-06 hunting rifle he'd found in a closet, cleaning and oiling them with practiced efficiency. He positioned his limited supplies, water, ammunition, a first aid kit, in the central library, which offered the best cover. Ghost stayed close, a silent shadow, his senses on high alert. The dog knew a storm was coming, and it wasn't just the one outside. They came just after dark, their approach masked by the roaring wind and swirling snow. 2 heavy-duty trucks, moving without headlights, their dark shapes barely visible against the white landscape. Elias saw them through a slit in one of the boards, his eyes, long accustomed to watching for threats in the dark, picking out the unnatural movement. The truck stopped 100 yards from the lodge. 4 figures emerged, clad in black winter gear, moving with the disciplined economy of trained professionals. Sterling was one of them, directing the others with sharp, decisive hand signals. They weren't coming to talk. They didn't assault the lodge directly. That would be foolish, a frontal attack on a fortified position. Instead, 2 of the men circled around to the rear. A few minutes later, a bright orange glow bloomed against the snow. The woodshed. They had set it on fire, hoping the blaze would draw him out, force him into their pre-arranged kill zone. The flames roared, casting dancing, distorted shadows across the clearing. As the men advanced toward the house under the cover of the distraction, one of them moved too close to a side window Elias had left unboarded for a clear line of sight. It was a mistake. Before Elias could even raise his rifle, Ghost launched himself forward. He hit the glass with his full weight, shattering it in an explosion of sound and fury. The dog, a 75-pound blur of muscle and teeth, slammed into the man, knocking him off his feet. The man screamed, a sound of surprise and pain that was quickly cut off. A second man spun around, raising a suppressed pistol, and fired twice. One shot went wide. The other struck home with a sickening thud. Ghost yelped, a sharp cry of agony, and his attack faltered. He stumbled back, his front leg collapsing under him as he fell to the snow, a dark stain spreading rapidly on his fur. Seeing Ghost fall broke something loose inside Elias. The grief, the exhaustion, the years of holding himself together, it all burned away, leaving behind a core of ice-cold clarity. The Hollow Man was gone. Master Sergeant Thorne was in command. He didn't feel anger. He felt a profound, lethal focus. He used the fire they had set against them, its flickering light ruining their night vision while he remained in the shadows of the lodge. He slipped out a back door, circling wide through the deep snow, the wind covering his sound. He came up on their flank, a ghost in the blizzard. He engaged the first man, the one who had shot his dog, not with a firearm, but with the brutal, silent efficiency of hand-to-hand combat. The man went down without a sound. The second was taken out by a crippling shot to the knee from the rifle. He screamed, and the sound panicked the others. Sterling and the last man broke and ran for their trucks. Elias raised the rifle again, took a steady breath, and put a single round through the engine block of the lead vehicle. A second shot shredded a front tire on the other. They were trapped. Before the assault began, he'd made one call on a small encrypted satellite phone he kept in his emergency kit. He'd called Eleanor Vance. He told her everything, giving her the password to an encrypted file he'd uploaded to a secure server. It contained scans of Alistair's entire journal and the most critical pages of the ledgers. "If you don't hear from me by 0600, he'd told her, send it to the list. The list included a trusted investigative journalist he knew from his time in the service, a contact at the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, and his daughter, Sarah. The fight wasn't just for his life anymore. It was to ensure the truth saw the light of day. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving behind a world of pristine, silent white. The first sounds were the distant sirens. Acting on Elias's instructions, Eleanor had called the state police. They arrived to a scene of controlled, quiet chaos. 2 disabled trucks, 2 injured men zip-tied and waiting, and Elias Thorne inside the lodge, by the fire, pressing a makeshift bandage to the bleeding shoulder of his dog. Sterling and his men were ex-special operations, working as contractors for Global Strategic Solutions. Under federal interrogation, the conspiracy unraveled with astonishing speed. GSS was a front, a cutout for a powerful and deeply entrenched faction of private interests and corrupt intelligence officials, the direct descendants of the network Marcus Thorne had belonged to. They had been hunting for Alistair's ghost fund for 4 decades, an obsession passed from one generation of jackals to the next. But this time, they failed. Elias's encrypted package detonated like a bomb in Washington. The journalist's story, backed by the irrefutable evidence of Alistair's journal, went viral. The Inspector General's office launched a full-scale investigation. Names were named, careers were ended, and powerful men were indicted. Alistair Finch's story was finally told, not as a rogue agent or a hunting accident victim, but as a man who tried, in his own flawed way, to uphold a code of loyalty to the soldiers he commanded in the shadows. His name was cleared, his memory honored. A week later, Ghost was resting on a bed of blankets by the fire. The vet in Garnet Creek had removed the bullet and stitched him up. He was old and hurt, but he was tough. He would walk with a limp, just like his master. Elias heard a car coming up the drive. It wasn't an official vehicle. It was a small sedan, and when the driver's door opened, his heart seized. It was Sarah. She stood there for a moment, looking at the lodge, then at him as he stepped onto the porch. She looked older, her face etched with a new maturity. She had gotten his email. She had read the journal. She had seen the news reports. In her eyes, he didn't see the pity or fear he had grown used to. He saw a glimmer of understanding, of something akin to awe. "I read about the Miller family," she said, her voice soft. "The fund was helping them. Was he related to your friend? Sergeant Miller from the attack?" Elias could only nod, his throat tight. He learned that Alistair's quiet network, guided by his journals, had identified Miller's family as needing support. and had been anonymously funding his children's college education for the past 2 years. The circle had closed in a way he never could have imagined. Sarah walked up the steps, and for the first time in years, she hugged him. "I think I get it now, Dad," she whispered. "Why you couldn't come home. You never really left the war." He stood in the great room of the lodge, his daughter beside him, his dog resting at his feet. The fortune from behind the fireplace was now in the hands of a board of trustees, all combat veterans he had vetted himself, and its mission was being expanded, continuing Alistair's legacy. The lodge his uncle had given him as a final, cruel joke, a place to be forgotten, a place to let the ghosts win, had become the one place on earth that had saved him. It had given him a new mission, returned his daughter, and reaffirmed the only thing he had ever truly believed in: you don't leave your people behind. The man who had arrived broken had found a way to come home.